The sirens began before dawn. Across the blackened skyline of London, searchlights clawed at the clouds, while the distant drone of engines rolled over the city like approaching thunder. Families rushed underground, clutching blankets and gas masks. Somewhere above them, hidden behind layers of smoke and darkness, hundreds of German bombers crossed the English Channel in tight formation. Then came the first explosions. Windows shattered across the East End. Entire streets vanished beneath collapsing brick and flame. Fire brigades screamed through the night while anti-aircraft guns hammered the sky with desperate fury. By morning, the city looked as though it had survived an earthquake. Burned buses lay overturned beside craters large enough to swallow buildings whole. Yet Britain had not surrendered. It was only the beginning. The Battle of Britain was not merely another military campaign of the Second World War. It was the first major conflict fought almost entirely in the air. A struggle where radar stations, fighter squadrons, industrial production, and human endurance would decide the fate of Europe. Had Britain fallen in 1940, Nazi Germany might have controlled the continent unchallenged. The war, and perhaps the modern world itself, could have taken a radically different course. To understand how Britain reached this moment, one must return to the summer of 1940. France had collapsed with shocking speed. German panzer divisions had shattered Allied resistance in only 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force escaped annihilation at Dunkirk, but it left behind most of its heavy equipment on the beaches of northern France. Across Europe, Hitler appeared unstoppable. Poland had fallen. Norway had fallen. Belgium and the Netherlands had fallen. Paris was occupied. Only Britain remained defiant. Adolf Hitler did not initially seek the destruction of the British Empire. In many ways, he admired it. He believed Britain might eventually accept German dominance over continental Europe in exchange for peace. Some members of the British political establishment quietly considered negotiation after the disaster in France. But Prime Minister Winston Churchill refused any compromise with Nazi Germany. His speeches became weapons of morale. Inside Parliament and across radio broadcasts, Churchill promised resistance to the very end. "We shall fight on the beaches," he declared. "We shall never surrender." That refusal transformed Britain into Hitler's final obstacle in Western Europe. Yet invading Britain was enormously difficult. The English Channel served as a natural defensive barrier, and the Royal Navy remained the most powerful naval force on Earth. German planners understood that any amphibious invasion, codenamed Operation Sea Lion, could succeed only if the Luftwaffe first destroyed the Royal Air Force. Without air superiority, German troop transports crossing the Channel would be slaughtered. Thus began the air campaign that would become known as the Battle of Britain. In July 1940, German aircraft intensified attacks against British shipping convoys in the English Channel. The goal was both strategic and psychological: weaken British supply lines while provoking RAF fighters into battle. Luftwaffe commanders believed the RAF could be exhausted and destroyed through attrition. On paper, Germany possessed overwhelming strength. The Luftwaffe deployed approximately 2,600 aircraft during the campaign, including deadly Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters, twin-engine Bf-110 heavy fighters, Heinkel He-111 bombers, Dornier Do-17s, and Junkers Ju-88s. Opposing them, the RAF initially fielded around 700 serviceable fighter aircraft, primarily Hawker Hurricanes and the faster, more agile Supermarine Spitfires. But numbers alone concealed critical weaknesses in the German position. The Luftwaffe had been designed primarily to support rapid ground offensives, not conduct long-range strategic bombing campaigns. German fighters possessed limited fuel capacity. Once over southern England, Bf-109 pilots often had only minutes before they were forced to return to France. Bombers flying deeper into British territory frequently lost fighter protection at the most dangerous point of their missions. Britain, meanwhile, possessed advantages invisible from the air. The most important was radar. Along the southern coast stood the Chain Home radar network, tall steel towers capable of detecting incoming aircraft long before they crossed the channel. This revolutionary system allowed RAF Fighter Command to conserve precious resources. British pilots did not waste fuel endlessly patrolling the skies. Instead, They remained grounded until enemy formations were detected, then launched precisely where needed. At the center of this defensive system stood Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, commander of RAF Fighter Command. Calm, methodical, and deeply analytical, Dowding understood Britain could not afford unnecessary losses. Rather than pursuing spectacular victories, he focused on preservation. Every fighter pilot was precious. Every aircraft mattered. Dowding's integrated defense network became one of the most sophisticated military systems of the war. Radar stations fed information into centralized command rooms, where operators tracked German raids in real time. Orders were then transmitted to sector stations that directed fighter squadrons toward incoming targets with remarkable efficiency. To German pilots, it often appeared as though British fighters magically materialized exactly where they were needed. The first phase of the battle intensified throughout July and early August. Dogfights erupted daily over the Channel. Pilots on both sides endured unbearable stress. RAF airfields operated continuously under threat of bombing. Young fighter pilots, many barely 20 years old, scrambled several times a day into lethal combat. Inside a Spitfire cockpit, battle unfolded at terrifying speed. Engines screamed at maximum power. Condensation trails twisted across the upper atmosphere. Machine gun fire flashed through clouds. Pilots often spotted enemies only seconds before firing. A single burst could ignite fuel tanks or tear wings apart instantly. Survival depended on instinct. Many RAF pilots suffered exhaustion bordering on collapse. Some flew 4 or 5 combat sorties in a single day. Sleep became irregular. Fear became routine. Yet Britain's pilot force was more international than many realize. Alongside British airmen fought experienced volunteers from occupied Europe, especially Poland and Czechoslovakia. Polish pilots, hardened by the brutal invasion of their homeland in 1939, became some of the most effective fighter aces of the campaign. Number 303 Polish Fighter Squadron achieved extraordinary kill ratios despite language barriers and initial skepticism from British commanders. One lesser-known detail of the battle was how close Britain came to disaster in late August 1940. RAF airfields in southern England suffered relentless attack. Hangars burned, runways cratered, communication systems failed repeatedly. Fighter command's resources were stretched dangerously thin. Some historians argue that another 2 or 3 weeks of concentrated attacks on RAF infrastructure might have broken Britain's defensive system entirely. Then came one of the most consequential strategic decisions of the war. On August 24th, several German bombers accidentally dropped bombs on central London, likely due to navigational errors. In response, the RAF launched retaliatory raids against Berlin. Militarily, the bombing caused limited damage. Psychologically, however, it enraged Hitler and Hermann Göring. Until then, the Luftwaffe had largely concentrated on RAF airfields and military infrastructure. Now Hitler demanded vengeance. German strategy shifted toward massive bombing raids against London and other cities. It was a turning point. Beginning on September 7, 1940, hundreds of German bombers struck London in broad daylight. Docklands erupted in flames visible for miles. Warehouses exploded beside the Thames. Entire districts vanished beneath firestorms. Civilians fled through streets covered in shattered glass while rescue crews dug survivors from rubble with bare hands. The Blitz had begun. For 57 consecutive nights, London endured bombardment. The psychological effect was immense. Air raid sirens became part of daily life. Families slept in underground stations. Children were evacuated to the countryside. Hospitals overflowed with burn victims and amputees. Smoke permanently stained the skyline. Yet the German shift toward civilian targets granted fighter command a critical reprieve. RAF airfields that had been near collapse gained time to repair runways, restore communications, and rotate exhausted squadrons. Aircraft production continued at astonishing speed. British factories, many dispersed to avoid destruction, produced fighters faster than Germany anticipated. By the autumn of 1940, Britain was replacing aircraft losses more efficiently than the Luftwaffe. German intelligence disastrously underestimated this reality. Luftwaffe commanders increasingly believed the RAF was nearing destruction because British fighters appeared less frequently over some targets. In truth, Dowding was carefully conserving strength and choosing engagements selectively. On September 15th, the battle reached one of its decisive climaxes. That morning, massive German formations crossed the Channel toward London. Radar stations detected them early. RAF squadrons scrambled from multiple airfields simultaneously. Soon the skies above southern England became a vast battlefield. Witnesses described hundreds of aircraft twisting through clouds while anti-aircraft shells burst around them like black flowers. Pilots engaged at point-blank range. Burning bombers spiraled toward the earth, trailing smoke and debris. German losses mounted rapidly. By evening, the Luftwaffe had failed to cripple British defenses. More importantly, German leadership finally recognized a grim truth. Air superiority over Britain was unattainable. Operation Sea Lion was indefinitely postponed. Although bombing raids continued for months, the immediate threat of invasion faded. The reasons for Britain's survival were numerous and interconnected. Radar provided early warning and efficient fighter deployment. Dowding's command system maximized limited resources. British aircraft production exceeded expectations. The Royal Navy remained a terrifying obstacle to invasion. German fighters lacked operational range. Luftwaffe intelligence repeatedly misjudged RAF strength. And perhaps most importantly, Britain retained the ability to recover damaged pilots and aircraft on home soil. German losses were severe. During the campaign, the Luftwaffe lost roughly 1,700 aircraft and thousands of trained aircrew. Britain suffered heavily as well, losing over 1,000 aircraft. And many experienced pilots. Civilian casualties during the Blitz were catastrophic. Tens of thousands died. Entire neighborhoods disappeared beneath rubble and fire. But the strategic consequences extended far beyond Britain itself. The Battle of Britain marked Nazi Germany's first major military failure of the Second World War. Until then, Hitler's forces had seemed invincible. The failure shattered the myth of unstoppable German expansion and demonstrated that the Axis war machine could be resisted. It also altered global politics. American public opinion shifted gradually in Britain's favor as images of bombed cities and exhausted civilians spread across newspapers and radio broadcasts. President Franklin Roosevelt increased support through programs like Lend-Lease, helping Britain continue the war despite immense economic strain. Most critically, Britain's survival created a future launching point for Allied offensives. Without Britain, there would have been no strategic bombing campaign over Germany, no North African staging ground, and perhaps no D-Day invasion in 1944. The battle also exposed the growing importance of technology in modern warfare. Radar, centralized command systems, industrial logistics, and intelligence analysis proved just as decisive as bravery in combat. The age of mechanized total war had fully arrived. Yet behind every strategic conclusion stood human suffering. Night after night, civilians emerged from shelters to discover entire streets erased. Firefighters worked until collapse amid infernos so intense that asphalt melted beneath their boots. Pilots disappeared into clouds and never returned. Young men burned alive inside aircraft traveling hundreds of miles per hour. Many survivors carried psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Even victory carried exhaustion. Churchill later immortalized RAF fighter pilots with one of the most famous lines of the war. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The phrase captured more than gratitude. It reflected how terrifyingly narrow Britain's survival had been. Historians continue debating whether Germany ever truly possessed the capability to invade Britain successfully. Some argue the Royal Navy alone would have annihilated any crossing attempt regardless of air superiority. Others believe that had the Luftwaffe maintained pressure on RAF infrastructure rather than shifting toward London, fighter command might have collapsed. The debate remains unresolved. What is certain is that the Battle of Britain changed the trajectory of the 20th century. Had Britain fallen in 1940, Hitler could have consolidated Western Europe before turning east against the Soviet Union. American involvement in the war may have been delayed or transformed entirely. Democratic resistance in Europe might have collapsed. Millions more could have died beneath Nazi domination. Instead, Britain endured, and in the black skies above southern England, the course of world history turned on fuel gauges, radar pulses, exhausted mechanics, and the courage of young pilots who climbed into the air knowing each mission might be their last. Long after the fires of the Blitz faded, the ruins remained as silent testimony to the cost of survival. The Battle of Britain was not won through a single dramatic moment or miraculous weapon. It was won through endurance, through thousands of ordinary decisions made under extraordinary pressure. That is perhaps the cruelest truth about war. History often remembers grand speeches and decisive victories, but nations are truly shaped by what people are willing to endure when destruction seems inevitable. In 1940, Britain stood alone against the most powerful military force in Europe. Cities burned, families died, entire generations were scarred forever. Yet the island did not fall, and from those smoke-covered skies emerged one of the defining lessons of modern history: that even in humanity's darkest hours, the outcome of war is never determined solely by strength or numbers, but by resilience, adaptation, and the refusal to surrender when fear says surrender is inevitable.